If you only looked at the headlines, the Gaza war might seem like a straightforward military campaign. But in reality, it's also a mirror of Israel's deepest domestic divides, its coalition politics, and its unresolved questions about identity and strategy. Welcome to Global Risk Profile, where we break down the headlines that matter and the ones that should. Let's be honest, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one of the most complicated and emotionally charged issues in the world. To explain it properly would take not one episode, but 5 or 10. Entire careers are dedicated to studying it. But complexity isn't a good enough reason to avoid it. What we can do here in a single episode is trace one strand that perhaps has not been explored enough. How Israel's domestic politics have influenced the war in Gaza, how it began, how it has unfolded, and why it hasn't ended. The war didn't start in a vacuum. Israel has been mired in political instability for years. Between 2019 and 2022, the country went through 5 elections in less than 4 years. In 3 of those, Benjamin Netanyahu received a mandate to form a government, but didn't manage to. In one, his rivals, Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, managed to build a short-lived coalition that ousted him. Only in the last election of November 2022 did Netanyahu return with a governing coalition, the same one in power today. Why so many elections? It partially comes down to Israel's political system. The entire country is one electoral district, with the 120 seats in the Knesset allocated proportionally. Because the threshold for entry is low, just 3.25% of the national vote, small parties with narrow agendas routinely win seats. No party has ever held a majority on its own, which means every Israeli government is a coalition. And in a coalition, even a small party with half a dozen seats can hold an outsized influence. They can make or break a government, which forces Prime Minister to balance demands that often pull in opposite direction. By 2023, that balancing act was already under immense strain. Netanyahu's fragile coalition depended on very right-wing parties as well as ultra-Orthodox religious parties. All the center-right and center-left parties were part of the rival Lapid-Bennett short-lived government and declined to join that coalition. At the same time, the country was in turmoil over judicial reforms meant to claw back power from the judicial branch and civil service to elected officials. That triggered the largest street protests in its history. It was because, though across the political divide people have expressed similar sentiments in the past, many felt this reform went too far in removing any checks on the executive branch, which already in effect controls the parliament from which it emanates. Former military and intelligence chiefs warned that the state's cohesion was weakening, and Israel's adversaries were watching. Hamas may have seen those divisions as an opportunity, though sources diverge. Regardless, Hamas severely miscalculated Israelis rallying together once the October 7th disaster happened. When the October attacks came, the country was shocked to its core. For a brief moment, unity re-emerged, but it was fragile. Some called for Netanyahu's resignation even as the war began. To stabilize decision-making, opposition leader Benny Gantz and his party were brought into a temporary war cabinet and stayed in for several months. But even then, political calculations were never far from the surface. Every military choice potentially carried a second layer. Would it preserve or collapse the coalition holding in place? One of the sharpest fractures in Israeli society has been laid bare by the ongoing war. The government's seeming dependence on ultra-Orthodox parties. Their demand is clear: permanent military exemptions for their young men, along with stipends for lifelong Torah study. What began as a narrow compromise under Ben-Gurion in 1948 has grown into a mass entitlement program. Meanwhile, secular and traditional Israelis have been called up for 100 or 200 days of reserve duty over the past 2 years, risking life and limb. The imbalance strains social cohesion. In a war that requires national endurance, many Israelis ask, why should some communities sacrifice so much while others remain exempt? Inside the coalition, hardline partners demand nothing less than total victory. For them, anything short of Hamas's destruction risks betrayal of their voters. For the government, that creates a trap. End the war without achieving total victory over Hamas, and the coalition risks collapse. Continue the war indefinitely, and Israel bears the costs in blood, legitimacy, and international patience. At the same time, the trauma of October sustains public willingness to keep fighting. This dynamic sustains a degree of public support for the ongoing fighting, even as questions mount about long-term strategy. It's crucial to pause for a moment at this point and consider the nature of terrorist organizations and how it has manifested in this conflict. The horrendous torture, killing of over 1,000, and abductions to use as bargaining chips of men, women, and children, including infants, on October 7, 2023. The total disregard for human life on the Israeli side, but also on their own Palestinian side. Moreover, the intentional embedding of military assets within their own population to maximize their civilian deaths as a tool of pressure on Israel, etc., etc. All these mean that perhaps it would not have mattered at all what the Israeli government would have done. We'd still be in the same place today. To make a deal, one needs two willing parties, and it has been reported that Hamas had reneged on potential deals many times. There is an interesting analogy we might want to explore. Let us step back and head again to the fictional world of Tom Clancy. In his 1991 book, The Sum of All Fears, after a nuclear attack on Denver, the US president wants to retaliate by wiping out an Iranian city. The protagonist, Jack Ryan, refuses to confirm the order. He says vengeance for humiliation is no excuse to kill hundreds and thousands of civilians, and the Iranian leader who ordered the attack could be killed in other ways without so much collateral damage. Applied to Gaza, the question is haunting many in Israel and many outside of it. How many Gazans must die to satisfy a decisive victory and to send the message? This prompts reflection. How far must the war go to achieve its aims? Look at recent history. Hezbollah was decimated by Israel in September 2024 with the Beeper operation and other attacks, and that cascaded to the fall of the Assad regime in Syria. Iran's nuclear program was stuck by Israel and the US in June 2025 for 12 days. In both cases, the adversaries survived but were strategically weakened, and the operations ended swiftly. Yet in Gaza, the war drags on, with some rhetoric about wiping out the Strip and deporting its inhabitants altogether. Such ideas might complicate the war's trajectory and Israel's global standing. This also breaks with decades of Israeli military doctrine of swift, limited, and decisive wars. The strategy has blurred. Is it still just military logic? This brings us to the second point: how to assess leaders with nuance. The same leader can succeed in one arena and fail in another, and must gain credit and bear responsibility for both. American views complicate the picture further. The lesson is clear: don't project US partisan instincts onto Israeli politics. Leaders can't be judged in black and white. Their actions reflect coalitions, incentives, pressures, and timing. Meanwhile, the outside world grows restless. Washington and European capitals press harder for ceasefires and hostage deals. Too much compromise abroad could unravel the coalition at home. Too little flexibility risks losing support from Israel's closest allies. One result is a war fought in fits and starts, with truces that collapse, negotiations that stall, and no apparent decisive endgame. What Gaza shows us is something bigger. Wars aren't just shaped by battlefield logic. They're shaped by domestic politics, everywhere. That in itself is not wrong. It is natural. Every country's foreign policy reflects its internal debates, its divisions, its survival instincts. The deeper question is, what do those domestic pressures produce? Do they lead to outcomes that, in the long run, protect life, strengthen societies, and endure? Or do they lead to cycles of violence and decay? Leaders shouldn't be judged as purely heroes or villains. The same person can excel in one moment and falter in another, depending on circumstances. What matters for Israel, for the US, for any country, is whether decisions taken under domestic pressure stand the test of time. International relations, in the end, are often downstream of domestic politics, and history judges not by partisan loyalty, but by whether actions serve the people and followed universal principles that all cultures share. That's it for this episode of Global Risk Profile. If you found this useful, thoughtful, or just different, please subscribe, share, and leave a review. Remember, the headlines may change, but the deeper patterns rarely do. Thanks for listening, and stay sharp.